Okay. Good. Then, welcome back to the Dare to Care podcast, where we explore the stories, challenges, and also the solutions shaping the future of animal welfare. My name is Masha. I'm a registered nurse and also veterinarian, and also always happy to learn more about and talk about animal welfare. And today I'm your host. We're joined by Anna Fourage. I came across her LinkedIn post a couple of weeks ago, and I just reached out to you. So I'm really glad that you, first of all, replied, and that you also agreed to be on the podcast. Today we're diving into the topic, into a topic that's pretty complex and also important. It's the welfare and also the ethical management of captive bears, specifically. We will talk about what good welfare for captive bears actually looks like, why also traditional indicators kind of often fall short, and then, of course, how facilities that keep bears can apply more holistic, also behavior-driven approaches to care. So I'm really glad that you're here, and so settle in this eye-opening discussion. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you for having me, Masha. I'm really happy to be chatting with you today.
I haven't really mentioned anything about you, so you're free to introduce yourself. What is your background? Where you're based right now also might be interesting, because we had kind of not a struggle, but we had to deal with time difference. So this might be also interesting for the listeners to know.
Right. Yeah. So I'm currently based in Bangkok, in Thailand. I've been here for about 10 years, but I've been in Asia for 20. I was in China for 10 years before. And I started working really in animal welfare when I was in China. I had a corporate job where I was just very busy doing things in offices and spending all my time behind a computer. And then one day I decided to change my ways and start volunteering in a dog shelter in Shanghai. And that's really where my journey began. I started volunteering and ended up creating a companion animal rescue to rescue animals from the shelter because the conditions were so appalling. And that's how I got into it. And then I became interested in ethics of euthanasia, and enrolled on a great master's course in Edinburgh, International Animal Welfare Ethics and Law. It was a really fantastic course. I was able to do that online over a period of a few years, so I could fit that in with other commitments. Then I moved to Thailand and started working with captive wildlife and started my PhD, which I just completed, thankfully. Yay! And
Congrats.
I have been working rather with a tiger charity called Fourage since 2018, where we do welfare assessments of captive tigers in all of the facilities around Thailand. So even though I published this paper about bear welfare assessments, I have been doing welfare assessments for quite a few species. So I am not actually a super bear expert. They're one of the species I worked with my PhD, but there are a variety of other species as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this might be also really interesting to compare the species while we talk about this. Yeah, I think this always really helps because, there are differences in their behavior and their needs. I'm always kind of curious to learn about this personal story of why animal welfare. You've mentioned the shelter, but how did you end up in that shelter? What was the reason for you to do the volunteer work in the first place?
It's actually quite dramatic. I was on a plane with all of my colleagues. We were taking off from a town called Lijiang. It's at the Himalayan foothills and it's very high altitude. And as we took off, the plane wasn't gaining altitude. So everybody on the plane was screaming, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, I'm going to be on air crash investigation." And then I just had this really sort of strong sense of people at my funeral, and then I thought, oh no, what are they going to say about me? They're going to say that Anna likes shoes and bags, and I haven't really contributed anything meaningful in my life. And so that's when I said to myself, if I survive, I'm going to do something that I'm really passionate about, that I really love, that's meaningful. And I've always loved dogs and cats, so I literally landed, had a very large gin tonic, and found a shelter that needed help in Shanghai. They had hundreds and hundreds of dogs, and I became so sort of overwhelmed, I guess, with the need. They really didn't have any help, any resources. And then, as I said earlier, the conditions were so bad, I decided to start rescuing from the shelter, and that's how I and a few other people who I met in that shelter created a charity.
Okay, interesting. I mean, also a crazy story, to be honest. Yeah.
It was life changing. I'm so grateful that happened to me, because it really altered the course of my life.
Yeah. Yeah, because the story that you've then told us is just like, you went straight into it. Like doing the master and so on. So that's like, that's a pretty dramatic change of course.
Right.
And then how would you describe your view on animal welfare? Because I assume when you start getting involved in animal welfare, you have like your first impressions, first ideas of what it means. Would you say by now being involved in that field for 20 years, kind of, has it evolved? How would you describe maybe the change of your perspective and your view on animal welfare?
So when I first started out, I think I was really judging everything that I was seeing according to the standards that I was accustomed to in the UK. For example, euthanasia. And I remember one instance of a puppy in a vet clinic who had distemper, and this puppy was suffering so terribly and crying, and the vet was just sat there eating a sandwich. And I was like, why aren't you doing anything about it? Why aren't you euthanizing this puppy? And that's what I really started to understand, like the cultural attitudes and differences in euthanasia. And then obviously that's when I started exploring more into my masters. But so my views of animal welfare have really changed, like because I am based in a region where there aren't strong animal welfare laws. So I've had to stop comparing what I have to deal with to what we have, in the UK. So that actually has taken time, and I have to often remind myself about not to compare. But it also works in the other way, because sometimes you can get really used to seeing really bad. In my case, I do really a lot of work in zoos, seeing really bad zoos, and then when you see a zoo that's not quite as bad, you think, oh, it's okay. So you have to. I might go to a really great zoo sometimes just to make sure that my frame of reference is not really altered.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. And like keeping yourself on an awareness level that is still appropriate, and not getting too used to like circumstances or context. Okay, so then maybe, diving into the paper that you've published and like the post that I've came across. And so maybe first of all, it was about the welfare assessment tools that we have for bears. So now we started at least talking a little bit about bears. Maybe just like to start, you can summarize kind of the main findings of that study, and then also the strengths and limitations that you found out.
Yeah, so I designed this welfare tool to be super simple, and the reason I wanted it to be super simple was because I wanted it to be applicable in a lot of the zoos, which I term dysfunctional zoos actually. So we're talking about zoos with really limited resources, a lot of zoos with who don't do any kind of welfare assessments at all. And when I say dysfunctional zoos, I would just quickly like to point out what I mean, because I might be using the word quite a lot. The word, it means that, previously bad zoos were also called substandard zoos, but actually that doesn't do it justice to how bad these zoos are. They're dysfunctional because they contribute towards species decline, rather than zoos which should aim to contribute towards conservation as part of one of the main objectives of a modern zoo. So in a lot of these like dysfunctional zoos, they They don't have any. Maybe they don't even know about welfare. They don't know. They just think, okay, maybe, or they don't really care as long as they're making money. So I wanted to, but there are also equally, there are some zoos that do care about their animals. They just haven't had the same level of education. They don't have access to good journals. A lot of the articles are not in their native language, etc. So they just don't know. So I wanted to develop a tool that could be practically used by many kinds of zoos, rescue centres, etc. And I found that the key to do that was to make it as simplistic as possible. So you may know that when with assessing animal welfare, normally we can use quite a few different measures. We can use animal-based measures, looking at physiological factors for the animal, and we can also use resource-based measures. So I was interested in using resource-based measures because this is something that's really easy to look at. And I developed this tool as part of my PhD, so I wasn't actually going back of house in these facilities. I would go to these zoos and view these exhibits as a member of the public, so I could see everything that a zoo visitor would be able to see. And I found that was actually quite interesting because in a lot of the exhibits that I was assessing, they were rather barren. For example, if you have a bear in a very small, barren concrete enclosure, I don't necessarily have to do super complex physiological measures as well to understand that bear does not have good welfare potential. So I went to all of the bear exhibits that were on display in various zoo types in Thailand. And in my particular study, I looked at private zoos accredited by the Southeast Asian Zoo Association, and also government zoos. And what I found was that just under half of all the exhibits were smaller than the minimum standard of 279 square meters, which I used as a benchmark. And off the top of my head, that might have been an AZA, or Animals Asia minimum. And I also found that, over half, 54% had no vegetation, 62% had no enrichment. I should actually probably tell people what kind of criteria actually that I was using. So I looked at exhibit size. I looked at the topography. So it's important that bears aren't just on a flat surface. The shelter and shades, the kinds of furniture that was provided, the substrate, provision of vegetation, how clean, ventilation, light, environmental noise, the exhibit barrier as well, provision of enrichment and visual barriers. So it was 14 assessment criteria, graded on a score of 0, 1 to 2. So 0 being below minimum standard, 1 being meeting minimum, and 2 exceeding. So there was a very wide range of scores. The lowest scores like 5 in a government zoo, and then a high score of 27 in an accredited zoo. So there was actually a really big difference on the scores based on the type of zoo it was, and this illustrates the institutional priorities of the zoo type, actually.
Interesting. Because I don't know why, but I just had thought that governmental zoos also have an accreditation, that this kind of like goes hand in hand, but obviously it doesn't. Is that right? Right.
So a lot of because we have two native bear species in Thailand. We have the Asiatic black bear and the sun bear, Malayan sun bear, and a lot of the zoos are actually also functioning as some rescue centres as well. So that these are actually rescue centres that are open to the public. There are 26 government facilities in Thailand that do receive rescued wildlife, and there are some facilities with many bears which were not included in the study because they were close to the public. So The challenges, though, of course, with the government zoos is that sometimes they just don't know what kind of species they're going to have to house. So a lot of the time, the exhibits are very generic, and in the case of bears, as we know, they're very destructive. So they just are often cages or pits, just to safely enclose the bear. And in the private zoos, because of the very poor, I would say, pretty much non-existent zoo standards in Thailand, there aren't any specific requirements about how facilities have to keep their animals. So the private zoos, in my findings overall, in my thesis, it was that they were really prioritising profit over all other aspects of what being a good modern zoo entails. So they weren't paying attention to welfare at all.
So the tool that you kind of try to like find or shape this assessment tool, you mentioned like you pointed out some strengths, like it's kind of easy to apply, easy to use, but then also what are the limitations maybe? Are there some?
Yeah, for sure. So for example, assessing some measures like water, really important. Sometimes it was really hard to see in an exhibit. So if you have a really large exhibit, I couldn't see the water, but that wasn't because it wasn't there. It was because the exhibit was so big that I couldn't see. So I actually had to exclude that from the quantitative analysis of the assessment. And then, of course, there's other limitations. We know that, I can see everything front of house, but of course there are back of house areas as well. Really important. Captive animals spend a lot of time back of house. So that was something that I would have liked to have included if it was possible, but it just wasn't. And then it's also difficult when you look at, when you don't know the individual histories of the animals. When you look at the social grouping of bears, I didn't know the stories behind them. Why was this particular bear housed alone? And that would have been really helpful in being able to more accurately assess the whole welfare picture. So that was definitely there were definitely limitations, but I just tried to focus on, something that's really needed in many areas of the world, was just having something that people can use in all kinds of facilities. It's just like at least provides like a baseline indicator.
Yeah. From your experience, like in the zoos in Thailand or maybe also in other East Asian countries, if the zoo does some kind of assessment of animal welfare of its animals, who does it? Is it the manager of the zoo? Are the keepers doing that kind of assessment? Whose role is it traditionally?
So again, in Thailand, you have accredited zoos, as I mentioned, accredited by the Southeast Asian Zoo Association, and it's run by these particular zoos are run by the Zoological Parks Organisation in Thailand, and they're a good bunch of people, and they have on-site vets and management in place, and I know they do work hard to assess, and perhaps it will be keepers who are doing assessments, and they also work with great organisations like Wild Welfare, who may come in and assist them as well. But in a lot of the other facilities, they're just not doing the welfare assessments. Again, we have to really just take a step back and think, who are the people working in the zoos? So to give you an idea, in Thailand, maybe the keepers might make 200, maybe $200 to $300 a month salary. They have almost certainly received no formal training in zookeeping at all, or animal management, and in fact their job is perceived to be like really unskilled and undesirable. So they're not really doing any kind of formal assessment. And it might be, this animal seems quite sick, and then perhaps they will mention that to the zoo manager. But in many cases, there was not an on-site vet. So the formal assessment of welfare in the majority of zoos, I would say, is not happening. And that's not isolated to Thailand. I mean, I'm familiar with the zoos in Indonesia, some in Malaysia, Vietnam, etc. It's a similar situation.
Yeah, I mean, that's of course then a problem. If no one is responsible for it, if this is not a task that is given to someone specifically or like to a profession, then there's no framework of like when and how often to do it. That's a challenge, of course. So the assessment indicators that you looked at were more from just observing and more the environmental aspects. Would you say what are the most valid ones to assess bear welfare, like captive bear welfare? Because you have also behavioural one or a physiological one, and one thing is to like think about what is like easy to use, but then it's just the question like what is most valid.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, we should be using all indicators, right? We should be using behavioural, physiological, and environmental, and also management-based indicators. Like, for example, is there a vet on site? So ideally, this would be the case, of course. But in reality, this is not happening in most zoos. I think there could be aspects of behavioural indicators that could be used. So this assessment actually could be modified. So people could look at behaviour, for example, in bears. They could look at any abnormal repetitive behaviours, etc. That's not something that would be super difficult to implement. It's certainly like for people like me who are going around the zoos and doing these assessments. The reason I actually excluded it was because I had so many different zoos to visit, and it was challenging to be able to get multiple data points. So I didn't just want to go on a Tuesday morning and do like half an hour or an hour of behavioural observation, because I know that's not reliable. Ideally, I would have wanted to go different times of the day, etc., and spend more time collecting this data, but it simply wasn't feasible for this project. I would like to see some keepers, for example, who could be trained to look at behavioural indicators. But again, it's like part of like they're so resource poor in a lot of places, and a lot of the time there's just no institutional will. And again, it all comes back to the fact that if there are no zoo standards, they're not legislatively required to provide these or to conduct these assessments, then it's simply up to the zoo itself to say, yeah, we want to do this.
I mean, maybe, I don't know if you can answer that question, but like, what does it need to like open a zoo in Thailand? What do you need to do for that? Do you need to apply? What kind of legislation do you have to like keep in mind? How easy is it to just like open a public zoo?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I was at a conference, the Wildlife Animal Rescue Network conference in Hua Hin over the last few days, and during the conference, some work that I had done with an organisation called Wildlife Friends Foundation Thailand. They're a really great sanctuary, rescue and rehab facility, the largest in the country actually. They've also got a lot of bears, they've got tigers, elephants and many animals. But together with Wildlife Friends Foundation, we worked on a paper looking at the issue of lions as pets in Thailand. So in Thailand, it's actually legal to own a lion as a pet. So we did a study over 7 years where we monitored the number of lions that we were seeing in zoos, in private homes, so people posting them on social media, in mini zoos and cafes. If you've got a coffee shop,
lion in a cafe, okay.
Oh yes, in Bangkok, yes. Many places actually. You go, you buy your coffee, and you go and you take a selfie with a lion, and it's all legal. Since 2022, when some wildlife legislation was amended, they added lions under this legislation. Prior to that, you didn't need any license at all to keep a lion. But the reason I'm telling you this is because you can have a lion or an other non-native species as a zoo and not need any zoo license.
Okay.
So if you were to have a native species, let's say you have a tiger, an elephant, and you would need to have a zoo license because they are species that are native to Thailand. So I'm hoping at some point the law will change to mean that for all facilities displaying captive wildlife, you need to have zoo license, where there are standards, minimum standards. For example, going back to the lions, you only need to provide a 3 metre by 3 metre enclosure. Yes.
Well, that's not even enough for myself.
Yes. So that's the current situation. So it's extremely easy to open a zoo. So it depends on what species, whether it's native or non-native. Let's say you have native species, you get a zoo license. It's basically looking at how the land within the zoo area is used. You can have a certain percentage which is used to build the enclosures, and then the majority has to be for like public facilities, etc. But there aren't any really clear standards mandating what exactly is required in terms of housing for these animals. And then you have to get your license renewed, but there are a whole host of challenges as well with having license with losing your license. Let's say, for example, some of your listeners might be familiar with a gorilla called Bois Noi. She's been she came from a German zoo about 30 years ago, I believe, and she's been housed on top of a department store zoo in downtown Bangkok. She's been alone for over 2 decades since her partner died, but she's in a concrete cage, basically. And there has been extensive outcry. Jane Goodall went to visit her and was very upset when she saw the conditions that Bois Noi was housed in. Cher also tried to campaign to have Bois Noi released. But guess what? The zoo wasn't breaking any zoo standards. And the owner of the zoo was like, nope, I want to keep her. Like, people pay money to come and see her. She's the only zoo on display in Thailand. And if I don't have to get rid of her, why would I? So it's just to illustrate, like, the standards are pretty much non-existent. So it's extremely easy to open and maintain a zoo there.
I mean, this kind of immediately leads me to the ethical question of, like, keeping wildlife and then also put them on display. You have studied, your study course at Edinburgh was also included ethics. Maybe just like quickly talk about the ethical challenges that you see, not only bears, but also like the other larger mammals. But I always like to also have a look on the smaller ones, because most of the time we talk about like these big animals like elephants and tigers and so on. But what is kind of your opinion on keeping wildlife in captivity, not only in Thailand, but in general, maybe?
You know, zoos have had such a bad press over the years. There's like a very strong anti-zoo movement. I believe that a good zoo is a really powerful tool for good. There are some amazing zoos around the world. A lot of people have been inspired by visits to a good zoo to want to help animals in the wild, and to perhaps look at and try to work hard to protect their environments as well, their habitats. So I think good zoos are really important, really inspiring places, as long as they're well managed, and there is really strong legislation in place and strong enforcement mechanisms to make sure that zoos are complying with standards. So I am not at all anti-zoo. I think they're important and they can do so much good. On the other hand, you have a lot of bad zoos, dysfunctional zoos, and as I mentioned earlier, these are facilities that are really contributing to species decline. So what do I mean? I mean that if you've got a really poor standard facility, you probably not giving that animal good welfare. That animal might not live very long, so you may go and acquire another animal from the wild to replace that animal. You're certainly probably not contributing in any captive breeding programs that are collaborating with other regional institutions, part of any stud books or species survival plans, or etc. One example of this is looking at a zoo in Bangkok that 10, 15 years ago now, was raided and had over 100 orangutans. So this institution was not part of any captive breeding program. And when you think about a lot of these facilities that have high number of species, threatened species, they're not contributing any of the genetic resources to global conservation efforts. So that in itself is really dysfunctional. Have I answered the question there? Because I could go off on a real tangent, but
yeah, I think at least in like parts. I mean, it was also a really, really big question because I mean, ethical. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Okay, just remember the other part of the question about like keeping the larger animals in captivity. Yeah. Okay. Zoos all have limited resources, don't they? Even the best zoos in the world, they don't have infinite space, infinite time, infinite money to care for animals. And this is one of the arguments about keeping larger species in zoos, is that by keeping these larger species, that they don't have the space then to house more smaller threatened species. And I can see that argument as well. But on the other hand, we all know that these charismatic megafaunas, the elephants, the bears, the tigers, they're bringing visitors through the zoo gates, and zoos need money to operate. So it's this really delicate balancing act of how do you choose which species to house in your collection that it's going to be for the greater good. Mm-hmm. And then also in terms of for the larger mammals, you also have unique challenges as well. And a species' ability to thrive in captivity can what is also connected to its size. Polar bears being a really famous example for that. They range over very large territories in the wild. How do you keep elephants really well in captivity? Tigers and bears, many other species. It's really complex for these larger animals. So some people say you should not house larger species that don't have the ability to thrive, i.e. to flourish according to their species specific characteristics.
Yeah, that's a really good argument. It's either you have like a few big ones or you have just like multiple smaller ones, but then again also looking at the different like species specific needs, because there are big differences in the species. I was wondering how, because you went to do your like assessment work and your research, you went in there as member of the public. So I was wondering, the rest of the members of the public that also go there to the zoos and are the visitors, what is it about? Well, first of all, zoos are also meant to like educate people. This is one aspect of like their like what a zoo could be used for. But then also I was wondering, when people from Thailand go to the zoos, are they aware of the things that they see, and how can one make them aware if they are not? Because sometimes it really helps, right, to have like the pressure from the public and then to bring change, to bring like things forward and to change things. This would be more like the bottom up approach, maybe. Yes, I was wondering how you think about that.
That's a really, really good question, because for actually one of the main findings and recommendations in my thesis, which looked at how do Thai zoos conform to the role of international zoos. So Thailand is quite a unique area, actually, when we look at zoos and the number of tourists and wildlife tourism. So you've got it's one of the most visited countries by international tourists every year. And, we have in Thailand, people come here, they want to have an interaction with a tiger, they want to have a tiger selfie, they want to feed a tiger cub, they want to ride an elephant. These things, they're high on a person's bucket list on their visit to Thailand. And we have seen change in Thailand over the years, and it is really, there is quite a distinction in the visitor demographic. So elephant camps are a really good example. So in the West, there was a greater awareness about the ethics of riding elephants. So you saw people from Europe, especially, who went to Thailand and they wanted to see an elephant, but then they realised they'd heard that riding elephants wasn't ethical. So then they started to look out for these ethical sanctuaries, which is a whole another discussion, because then you end up with these elephant sanctuaries who are greenwashing. They're pretending to be ethical, but really they're not. So there was we have seen a shift in behaviour when visitors are aware of the harms that is created when they participate in certain kinds of activities. The issue in Thailand is that a lot of the visitors who are participating now with elephants and in these tiger parks are coming from countries with really weak or non-existent animal welfare legislation. So, for example, there's a high number of Chinese tourists, and there is no animal welfare legislation in China that is, for example, certainly for companion animals. Okay, and I believe, I may be wrong, so for captive wildlife as well, if there are any laws for captive wildlife, it's minimal. And then we have a lot of Indian tourists and Russian tourists and Malaysian tourists. So the countries where legislation is absent or weak, and also societal understanding of and attitudes towards animal welfare is in a different place than it is in Europe, for instance. So for me, part of the solution to this problem would be to have targeted behaviour change campaigns in these countries. There have been successful instances of this. For example, in China, they had a campaign to reduce the consumption of shark fin soup, or ivory reduction campaigns. So we know it works. It just requires funding to go and implement these specific campaigns.
So you would say that focusing on international tourists would benefit more than focusing on local people in that sense? Well,
it also depends on where the zoo's located. So if you're looking at the zoos located in the main tourist hotspots in Thailand, then for sure you're getting mainly international tourists, because the price of admission is higher, the price of participating in these animal interactions is higher. If you're going into smaller regional zoos in central Thailand, etc., you might have very few international tourists, but it's just a whole different scale. We're talking in these tourist destinations, really exploitation. Tiger parks being a very good example, where there has to be speed breeding of tigers, a constant supply of cubs to satisfy tourist demand for that selfie and for that cub feeding interaction.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I've only recently kind of learned about the amount of tigers that you have in breeding captivity, in breeding farms, you could say, actually, and that they're bred for human entertainment, and you have sometimes in some countries more tigers in captivity than you have in natural habitats at the moment. And I was kind of struck by that number, and I was also surprised that at the same time it's incredible sometimes what humans, I don't know, I just sometimes don't get my own species of what we think, how much we can extract from the nature and use it for our own pleasure.
Right, and the tiger example is a really powerful one. In Thailand, you might have about 250 tigers in the wild, and that number has actually gone up in recent years because of sustained efforts, with more rangers patrolling the small areas of national park where tigers can be found, and introducing larger prey species to help increase tiger numbers. But then there are over 2,000 tigers in captivity in Thailand. And that's quite a lot. And when you think about, when you see the conditions that these tigers are kept in, it's really sad. They're in really small enclosures, and a lot of the tigers, when they're no longer useful as cubs and they're too big for interactions, there are valid concerns that these tigers then may be leaked into the wildlife trade.
Okay, that's a whole new topic again. Yeah, all this wildlife trade. Wow. Yeah, this needs another episode for sure. Um, one of the last questions that came up to my mind, because I had a conversation with someone from Wild Welfare a couple of weeks ago, and there we have briefly they talked about the challenges that you sometimes have because of language, of accessing then also new sources for knowledge and education. What is your opinion on that? Is that one of the barriers that you also see with zoos being able to learn and also use assessment, like welfare assessment tools? Is language a thing? Because, I mean, also your publication, that was published in English.
Right.
So a lot of research is happening in like one or two main languages that we use globally.
Right. Yeah, I think you had a guest on, Professor Samantha Ward, who wrote a really great paper about welfare assessments in developing countries. And in their paper, they discussed how language is an issue, and accessing the latest scientific knowledge is always a barrier. Yes, it is a barrier, but I would say that might only be a barrier in a small number of the already good institutions.
Mm-hmm.
When we're looking at dysfunctional zoos, they're probably not even looking at welfare assessments anyway, and so they're probably not even, they don't even care about their ability to access information, because they're not concerned. You know, the bears are actually quite a good example of a species that have a really hard time in captivity when they're in dysfunctional zoos, because you can keep a bear in the most awful conditions and it will still live a long time. They're tough. They are probably in horrible condition, but they're still alive. And there was one owner of a zoo here in Thailand who mentioned that in a news article, he mentioned that he must be taking care of the animals because they're still alive.
Yeah, and that's hard to like argue back, right?
Right. So the accessing information, I know is an issue in the good zoos, because, you know, I've had people ask me, hey, Anna, can you send me this paper? They know I have access to a university library. And, you know, for example, I had someone wanted to get some information about otters. They had I can't remember the case, but they needed to know something. And they knew the paper, but they just couldn't read it because they never had access. And that's a shame, actually. That's a shame. But it's also, there are so many barriers in publishing. If you're not publishing as part of an institution and you haven't got a funder, it may cost you a few $1,000 to publish. As an author, and then if you want to access it, you might have to pay, I don't know, $30-40 to read it one time.
Yeah, so also money plays a role. It's not only language, but also like your financial situation. Yeah. Okay, so I think we're almost run out of time. But the very last question I always have for my guests is, are there any like final tips, hints, advice you would like to give to listeners? Yeah, you can choose the topic if it's about assessment tools or about zoos in Thailand, and maybe you can think of young veterinarians. What kind of advice would you give to them?
Oh, I don't even know where to start with that. I mean, if I was talking to young veterinarians, I would say, if you have the opportunity to go to a place like Thailand and volunteer, you have great organisations again like Wildlife Friends Foundation who do take vets from overseas, and you can go and you can volunteer and you can get some incredible experience in the whole range of species that you probably would never have the opportunity to work with back home. And also just to go and visit some of these places, go to the good places, go to the dysfunctional places and see. And because it really opens your eyes when you are so used to going to a place where everything is so well managed, and then you see something that's not. It can really get you thinking. And more people that we have who can see, who have skills, who can go to these places, I think the more ideas that we can get, certainly in the animal welfare community to help these facilities, because some facilities are open actually to receive help and are open to mentorship. So that's probably something that I would say, just get out there and see.
See yourself. Yeah, thank you also for those advices. Thank you for your time, for sharing your stories. It was lovely meeting you finally, not emailing, but actually seeing and talking to you. It was really great to learn more about. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Okay, that's it for today on Dare to Care. Thank you for taking also the time to listen again, and I hope you've learned as much as I did and gained new insights. Have plenty to talk about at the next family meeting, a family dinner, or also the next small talk you have on the street. As always, you'll find lots of interesting links and also more information in the show notes. Be sure to take a look. And if you like what you heard today, then give us a lovely review, 5 stars. And also, as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, also feedback, either in the comments. You can also email at podcast.daretocare@gmail.com, or also send a message on Instagram at daretocare_podcast. You can also follow us there if you don't want to miss the next episode. So, see you next time. And remember, we need to stand up for others, especially for the non-human animals among us. Bye-bye.